5 and 6, me, Mr. A, back with more of Chapter 14 of Susan Cooper's Oversea Under Stone. So, they've just emerged from the cave, the tide's coming in, and they've just seen the Lady Mary under full sail come round the end of the headland towards them. Let's see what happens. Come on, quick! He grabbed at Barney and Jane as they stood motionless with shock and pushed them ahead of him. They jumped and slithered over the seaweed-cushioned rocks, away from the cave and the pursuing yacht. Barney clutched the Grail in one hand as he ran, his arms outstretched to keep his balance, and Simon held the manuscripts in their case grimly to his chest. He glanced back over his shoulder and saw the great white mainsail of the yacht crumpling down onto the deck, and a small dinghy being lowered over the side. Barney slipped and fell, and nearly brought them both down on top of him. Even as he fell, the Grail did not leave his grip, but struck the rock once more with the same clear bell-like note as before. It rang out over the sound of their splashing, hasty feet. He struggled up again, biting his lip at the sting of salt eating into a graze on his knee, and they hurried on. They were splashing through water all the while now. The waves had grown and were washing right over the rocks with every pulse of the rising tide. The water masked the pools and hollows with drifting brown weed and glossed the bare rock with a swirling coat that would turn soon into a current strong enough to dislodge their quick, desperate feet. Barney slipped again and fell with a splash. "Let me take it." "No!" He scrambled for a foothold, Jane pulling him up by his free arm, and the frenzied nightmare of a race drove them faster, zigzagging in wild, blind leaps over the wave-washed rocks. Simon glanced back again. 2 figures in a small dinghy were paddling fast towards them from the yacht. He heard the yacht's engines cough into life. "Go on, quick!" he gasped. "We can still do it!" They hastened on, half stumbling, kept on their feet only by their own speed. Still there was no sight of the beach round the headland, but only the sea on one side and the great wall of the cliff rising on the other, and before them, dwindling into the tide, the long path of rocks and weed. "Stop!" A deep voice rang out across the water behind them. "Come back, you stupid children! Come here!" "They won't catch us," Simon panted, catching Barney as he almost fell a third time, and jerking him back to his feet. Jane at his side was sobbing for breath at every step, but running and stumbling with the same desperate haste. Then round the headland in front of them, something else came into sight, and dropped their hopes like stones to the bottom of the sea. It was another dinghy, broad as a tub, breasting waves like a barge. The boy Bill sat at a chugging outboard motor in the stern, and Mr. Withers was leaning eagerly forward in front of him, his long dark hair blowing in the wind. He saw them and shouted with triumph, and they saw an unpleasant grin break on the boy's face as he turned the boat's nose towards the rocks in their path. They skidded to a halt, appalled. "Which way?" "Oh, they'll cut us off." "Oh, but we can't go back. Look, the others are going to land." With the edge of the water creeping round their feet, they looked distractedly back and forth. Not 10 yards ahead, the boat with Mr. Withers evilly smiling was heading to cut off their path, and behind them the other dinghy was bobbing almost at the edge of the rocks. They were caught, neatly, in a trap. "Come over here!" the deep voice called to them again. "You will not get away! Come here!" Mr. Hastings was standing up in his dinghy, a tall black figure, one arm flung out towards them, with his legs planted apart to keep him balanced, swaying with the boat's rise and fall on the swell. He looked as if he were straddling the sea. "Barnabas!" The voice dropped lower to a hypnotic monotone. "Barnabas, come here." Jane clutched at Barney's arm. "Don't go near him!" "No fear." Barney was frightened, but not bewitched into obedience as he had been before. "Oh, Simon, what can we do?" Simon stared up at the cliff, wondering for a wild moment if they could climb to safety, but the sheer granite face towered implacably up, far, far above their heads. They could never have found footholds there, even to climb out of reach, and they would have fallen long before they reached the top. "Barnabas," the voice came again, gentle, insidious. "We know what it is you have in your hand, and you too, Simon. Oh yes, Simon, especially you." Simon and Barney each closed a hand instinctively tighter round the manuscripts and the Grail. "They are not yours." The voice rose more roughly. "You have no right to them. They must go back where they belong." Mr. Hastings was watching them intently, poised in the dinghy, waiting for the right moment of the swell to jump across to the rocks. Only the heaving mounds of seaweed masking the edge made him hesitate. At the tiller, Polly Withers was struggling to control the boat in the rising waves. Barney shouted suddenly, "You can't have them! They're not yours either! Why do you want them anyway? You haven't really got a museum. I don't believe any of the stuff you said." Mr. Hastings laughed softly. The noise echoed eerie and spine-chilling over the gentle murmur of the sea. "You'll never win properly," Simon called defiantly. "You never do." "We shall this time," a lighter voice said behind them. They swung around again. It was Withers. The outboard motor had cut out, and quietly the other dinghy was edging nearer to them as the boy Bill groped for a rock with an oar. They drew closer together with their backs against the cliff, pressed as far away as they could, but on either side the boats crept closer towards them. The Lady Mary was edging slowly along off the headland. They could hear her engines thrumming faintly, though they could not see anyone on board. "If only we had a boat," Jane said in despair. "Couldn't we swim for it?" "Where to?" "There must be something we can do." Barney's voice rose frantically. "There is nothing at all you can do." Withers' light, sneering voice came over the rocks to them. He was less than 5 yards away in the bow of a tossing dinghy. "Give us the manuscript. Give it to us and we will take you off safely. The tide is rising fast now. You must give it to us." "What if we don't?" Simon called rebelliously. "Look at the sea, Simon. You can't get back now the way you came. Look at the tide, you're cut off. You can't get away unless you come with us." "He's right," Jane whispered. "Look." She pointed. Further along the rocks, the sea was already washing the foot off the cliff. "Where's your boat, Simon?" called the mocking voice. "Oh, we'll have to give in," Simon said, low and angry. "Take your time, Simon. We can wait. We've got all the time in the world." They heard the boy snicker on the other side of the boat. "They've got us. Oh, think. We can't give it up now. Think of great Uncle Mary." "It's a pity we ever thought of him in the first place," Simon said fiercely. "It's no good. I'm going to say we give in." "No," Barney said urgently, and before they realised what was happening, he had snatched the manuscript case from Simon and splashed forward over the wet rocks to the edge of the sea. He held up the long, glinting case in one hand and the Grail in the other, and gazed furiously at Mr. Hastings. "If you don't pick us up and let us take them home, I shall throw them in the sea." "Barney!" Jane croaked, but Simon held her back, listening. Mr. Hastings did not move. He stood looking across with an immense calm arrogance at Barney's small, bristling figure, and when he spoke, the deep voice was colder than any voice they had ever heard. "If you do that, Barnabas, I shall leave you and your brother and sister here to drown." They had no doubt he was speaking the truth, but Barney was carried away with a passionate indignation, and he was determined never again to believe anything that Mr. Hastings said. If once he did, he knew he would be under the spell again. I will! If you don't promise, I will!" He raised the Grail higher in his right hand, flexing his muscles to throw it. Simon and Jane gasped. The whole world seemed to stop and centre round the towering, black-clad man and a small boy, one will against another, and Barney saved by his own fury from the full force of the commanding glare driving into his eyes. Then Mr. Hastings' face twisted, and he let out a strangled shout, "Withers!" And from that moment, for the children, the world cracked into unreality, and there seemed no reason in anything that happened. From either side, Norman Withers and Mr. Hastings made a dive for Barney. Simon shouted, "Barney, don't!" and dashed towards him to clasp his outstretched arm. Withers, nearer, made a great leap onto the rocks from his boat, setting it swaying wildly with Bill clinging frantically to the tiller. But as his lunging foot came down where the rock should have been, they saw the viciousness in his face change to alarm, and he flung up his arms and disappeared under the water. He had jumped down on a masked pool among the rocks, the gap where the retreating sea had left deep water, and which now was filled far deeper than the incoming tide. Jane, cowering back against the cliff, chilled with horror as she realised that they would all three have gone headlong into it if they had run another yard further on. Withers surfaced again, coughing and spluttering, and Barney hesitated, the Grail still held over his head. Mr. Hastings had leapt across to the rocks without falling, and was coming at him from the other side with long, loping strides, his dark brows a menacing bar across his face, and his lips drawn back in a horrible, unlaughing grin. Simon dived desperately and was brushed aside by the sweep of one long arm, but in falling he grabbed at the man's nearest leg and brought him crashing down full length, on the wet, slippery rocks. Ah, right, tomorrow we'll find out what happens. We're right about at the conclusion now. Let's see how the children are going to get away, or if they'll get away. Meantime, I'll see you all tomorrow. Have a great day. Bye-bye.